Karen Mitchell had always prided herself on being reasonable. Standing in her pristine kitchen, staring at the certified letter that had arrived that morning, she forced herself to breathe slowly. The legal terminology swam before her eyes. Ancestral claim, treaty violation, unlawful occupation. Her hands trembled as she set the document on the granite countertop beside her untouched coffee. 23 years. She had lived in this house for 23 years, raised her daughter Emma here, buried her husband's ashes in the garden they'd planted together. The mortgage was finally paid off last spring, a celebration that now seemed absurdly premature. Though Mom. Letter was signed by someone named Joseph Crowfeather, represented by the Indigenous Rights Legal Collective. Karen had never heard the name, but something about it stirred an uncomfortable recognition she couldn't quite place. 3 hours north, Joseph sat in his truck at the end of a dirt road, staring at the house that shouldn't exist. The two-story, colonial with its manicured lawn and white picket fence occupied the exact spot where his great-grandmother's cabin had stood. He knew this with the certainty that comes from oral tradition passed down through generations, reinforced by surveyor maps his legal team had painstakingly reconstructed. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd learned about this place while serving overseas. A military buddy had shown him a real estate listing joking about fancy houses in the middle of nowhere. Joseph had gone cold, recognizing the landscape from childhood stories. The creek that curved behind the property, the distinctive rock formation on the eastern ridge. This was the land his people had been forced to leave in 1924, part of a voluntary relocation that was anything but voluntary. Returning from his third deployment with shrapnel scars and memories that kept him awake at night, Joseph had initially sought only to understand his family's history, but research had led to revelation to rage and rage to this moment. The legal claim wasn't about money, though the lawyers insisted it could be. It was about recognition, about correcting a wrong so old that most people had forgotten it was ever committed. Karen's neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, knocked on the back door as she always did around lunchtime, but today her expression was different, cautious, almost afraid. "Karen, dear, there's been a man asking questions about your house, about the land." He was very polite, but she wrung her hands. He said something about his family having lived here before the town was even established. The words hit Karen like physical blows. She thought of Emma, away at college, blissfully unaware that her childhood home was now under siege. She thought of her late husband David's workshop in the basement, still exactly as he'd left it. She thought of the herb garden where she'd scattered his ashes, where she went every morning with her coffee to tell him about her day. What did he look like? Karen asked, though she wasn't sure why it mattered. Tall, Native American, military bearing, you know how they carry themselves. Said his name was Joseph something. Very serious eyes, but not unkind, just determined. That evening, Karen sat in David's old chair, surrounded by deed papers and property records she'd pulled from their filing cabinet. Everything seemed in order, dating back to 1987 when they'd bought the house from the Hendersons, who'd owned it since the 1960s. Clean title, proper transfers, all the legal boxes checked. But legal and right weren't always the same thing, were they? David had taught her that, back when he was still practicing law. He'd handled a few cases involving historical injustices, nothing this personal, but enough for her to understand that sometimes the system failed people, and those failures echoed across generations. As darkness settled over the house, Karen found herself looking out at the land with different eyes. For the first time, she wondered who had walked these paths before her, who had called this place home before the colonial house and manicured gardens had erased whatever came before. Tomorrow, she would have to decide how to respond to the letter. Tonight, she simply sat in the gathering dark, feeling the foundation of her world shifting beneath her feet, wondering if some cracks were too deep to repair. The law office of Brennan and Associates occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian on Main Street, its creaking floors and water-stained ceiling betraying the building's age. Karen sat across from Tom Brennan, the family lawyer who'd handled David's estate and Emma's college paperwork. His usually jovial demeanor had been replaced by professional concern. "This is complicated," Tom said, adjusting his reading glasses as he reviewed Joseph's claim. "The documentation is extensive. Treaty records, original survey maps, witness statements from tribal elders. They've done their homework." Karen felt her stomach tighten. "But we own the house legally. We have clear title." "You do, but here's the issue. The original transfer of this land from tribal to federal ownership in 1924 may have violated treaty obligations. If that's proven, it could invalidate all subsequent property transfers." The words hung in the air like smoke. Karen thought of the call she'd had with Emma the night before, how she'd tried to keep her voice steady while explaining the situation. Her daughter's shock had been palpable, followed quickly by indignation. "Can't we just fight it?" Emma had demanded. "It's been nearly a century, Mom. Surely there's some kind of statute of limitations." But Tom had already explained that treaty. Violations operated under different legal principles. Some wounds, it seemed, never stopped bleeding. Meanwhile, Joseph sat in his own meeting 50 miles away in the tribal council offices. The room was sparse but dignified, with traditional artwork on the walls and the lingering scent of sage. Across from him sat Margaret Tallbear, the tribal attorney, and 2 council members, his second cousin Daniel and elder Rose Hawkwoman, who remembered his great-grandmother's stories. "The legal precedent is strong," Margaret was saying. "Similar cases in Montana and Wyoming have been successful. But you need to understand what you're asking for, Joseph. This isn't just about property. It's about disrupting lives." Joseph's jaw tightened. "What about the lives that were disrupted in 1924? My great-grandmother died in government housing, never seeing this land again. She was 93 and spent her last words telling me about the garden she'd had to abandon." Rose Hawkwoman spoke softly. "Your great-grandmother was my aunt's closest friend. I remember her stories too. But I also remember her wisdom. She always said healing requires understanding, not just justice. The current occupant," Daniel added, consulting his notes, "is a widow, lost her husband 2 years ago, raised a daughter in that house." Joseph felt an unwelcome stab of sympathy. He pushed it away. "That doesn't change what happened to our family. What was stolen?" Margaret leaned forward. "We could approach this differently. Request a meeting. Sometimes face-to-face conversation accomplishes more than legal proceedings." The suggestion made Joseph's chest tighten. He'd been preparing for a legal battle, not a personal encounter. War, he understood. You identified the enemy, developed strategy, executed with precision. This was messier, more complex. That afternoon, the call came to Karen's house. She almost didn't answer, but the caller ID showed the tribal office's number. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Margaret Tallbear, representing Mr. Joseph Crow Feather. We'd like to request a meeting, face-to-face if you're willing." Karen's first instinct was to refuse, to let the lawyers handle everything. But something in the woman's voice, respectful but firm, made her pause. What would be the purpose of this meeting? Understanding. Both of you have legitimate claims to this place, but for different reasons. Perhaps there's a solution that honors both. After she hung up, Karen stood in her living room looking at the family photos on the mantel. David in his army uniform from his brief service in the late 70s. Emma's graduation pictures. Their wedding photo, both of them so young and certain that love could conquer anything. But this wasn't about love. This was about history, justice, and the weight of decisions made by people long dead. She thought about what David would do. He'd always believed in facing problems head-on, in the power of honest conversation. 3 days later, Karen found herself sitting in the community center's main room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across from her sat Joseph Crowfeather, and she was surprised by her first impression. Margaret had been right about his military bearing, but his eyes held a sadness that spoke of loss deeper than property disputes. "Thank you for agreeing to this," Margaret began, but Joseph interrupted. "I want to see the house," he said quietly, looking directly at Karen. "I want to stand where my great-grandmother's garden grew. Before we talk about laws and ownership, I need to know what remains." Karen felt something shift inside her chest, not quite understanding, but the beginning of it. "Okay," she heard herself say. "When?" "Now," Joseph replied. "If you're willing." As they drove toward the house in separate cars, neither knew they were about to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. The house looked smaller with Joseph standing in front of it. Karen watched from her porch as he moved slowly across the lawn, his eyes scanning the landscape with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. He paused at the old oak tree near the eastern corner, his hand touching the bark with something approaching reverence. "This tree," he said without turning around. "My great-grandmother called it the prayer tree. She said it was already ancient when she was young." Karen felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. She'd always loved that oak, had hung a swing from its branches for Emma, had scattered David's ashes beneath its canopy. The idea that it held significance for someone else's family felt like an intrusion, yet also like a revelation. She hung tobacco offerings from its branches. Joseph continued, his voice so quiet Karen had to strain to hear, said it connected earth to sky, past to future. Margaret Tallbear had remained diplomatically silent during the drive, but now she stepped forward. "Joseph, perhaps we should—" "No." His voice was firm but not angry. "This is necessary." He walked toward the back of the house, toward what Karen knew was her herb garden. She followed reluctantly, Emma's earlier phone call echoing in her mind. "Don't let them guilt you, Mom. This is our home." But watching Joseph kneel beside her carefully, tended rows of basil and tomatoes, Karen felt the certainty of that statement waver. His movements were careful, almost ceremonial, as he brushed away loose soil with his fingertips. "Here," he whispered. "Right here." He looked up at Karen, and she saw tears in his eyes. She grew corn, beans, and squash. The three sisters fed the whole extended family from this spot. Karen's throat tightened. I grow herbs for cooking." The word sounded inadequate, almost apologetic. Joseph stood slowly, dusting soil from his hands. "My great-grandmother's name was Mary Crow Feather. She was born in 1898, married my great-grandfather when she was 16. They had 4 children on this land. When the government came in 1924, they were given 3 days to pack what they could carry." The specificity of his words hit Karen like physical blows. These weren't abstract historical grievances. They were family memories, personal losses, carried across generations. "Where did they go?" she asked, surprising herself. "Government housing 30 miles east. Concrete block buildings, 10 families to a structure. No gardens, no privacy, no connection to the land that had sustained them." Joseph's voice remained steady, but Karen could hear the controlled emotion beneath. Mary lived another 69 years, but never stopped talking about this place, about what she'd left behind. Margaret touched Joseph's arm gently. "Perhaps we should go inside." But Joseph shook his head. "Not yet." He looked at Karen directly. "Tell me about your family. How long have you been here?" The question caught Karen off guard. Part of her wanted to refuse, to maintain some emotional distance. But something in Joseph's bearing, the dignity of his grief, demanded honesty. 23 years. My husband, David, and I bought the house when our daughter was 2. He died 2 years ago. Cancer. The words still hurt to say. This place. It's where we built our life together. Where Emma learned to walk. Where we taught her to ride a bike. Where I said goodbye to my husband. Joseph nodded slowly. Loss lives in places, doesn't it? The land remembers. They stood in silence for a moment. 2 people separated by history but connected by their attachments to the same earth. Karen found herself looking at her property with new eyes, seeing not just her family's memories but the ghostly outlines of what had come before. "Can I ask you something?" Karen said finally. "What do you want? I mean, beyond the legal claim. What would make this right?" Joseph was quiet for so long that Karen wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, as if he were working through the answer himself. "I spent 3 tours overseas fighting for this country. Came back broken in ways I'm still discovering. The only thing that kept me going was the idea of home, of roots, of belonging somewhere. He gestured toward the house, the garden, the prayer tree. This place is my anchor. My great-grandmother's stories made it real for me when nothing else was. But we can't both live here, Karen said quietly. No, he agreed. We can't. Margaret stepped forward carefully. There might be other options. Shared custody arrangements, conservation easements, cultural preservation agreements. The law is more flexible than most people realize. But Karen could see in Joseph's eyes that legal flexibility wasn't what he was seeking, and if she was honest with herself, she understood. Some needs went deeper than compromise, some wounds required more than partial healing. As the afternoon wore on, they walked the boundaries of the property together. Karen pointing out improvements she and David had made, Joseph identifying landmarks from his great-grandmother's descriptions. The creek still followed the same path. The rock formation still caught the evening light the same way. The prayer tree still stretched its branches toward heaven. By the time they prepared to leave, something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer adversaries in a property dispute. They were two people trying to honor different versions of home, different claims to belonging, different understandings of what it meant to be rooted in a particular piece of earth. But understanding, Karen realized as she watched Joseph's truck disappear down the road, didn't make the problem any easier to solve. If anything, it made it more complex. How do you choose between competing claims when both are legitimate? How do you honor the past without sacrificing the present? That night, she called Emma again, but this time the conversation was different. This time, Karen found herself trying to explain not just the legal threat to their home, but the moral complexity of their situation. This time, she wasn't sure what the right answer was. The tribal council meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, but Joseph arrived early, needing time to prepare for what felt like the most important conversation of his life. The community room filled slowly with familiar faces, elders he'd known since childhood, cousins he'd grown up with, younger tribal members who looked at him with mixtures of respect and curiosity. Rose Hawk Woman took her seat at the head of the table, her weathered hands folded carefully before her. At 86, she commanded authority not through volume but through presence, through the accumulated wisdom of someone who had witnessed decades of struggle and survival. Joseph Crowfeather, she said formally, you have brought a matter before this council that affects not just you, but our entire community. Speak your truth. Joseph had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed his arguments about justice and treaty rights and historical wrongs. But facing these people, his people, the prepared words felt inadequate. 3 days ago, I stood on the land where our great-grandmother Mary built her life, he began. I knelt in the dirt where she grew food for 4 children and anyone else who needed a meal. I touched the tree where she hung her prayers. Murmurs of recognition rippled through the room. Mary Crowfeather's story was part of their collective memory, one of dozens of similar losses that had shaped their community's history. But I also met the woman who lives there now, Karen Mitchell, a widow who lost her husband 2 years ago, who raised her daughter in that house, who tends a garden where Mary's garden once grew. Joseph paused, feeling the weight of competing loyalties. She's not our enemy. She's just someone else who calls that place home. Daniel, his cousin, leaned forward. That doesn't change what happened to our family, Joseph. It doesn't change what was stolen. No, it doesn't, Joseph agreed. But it complicates what justice looks like. Rose Hawk Woman studied him carefully. You sound uncertain, nephew. This isn't like you. Joseph met her gaze. I've been certain about a lot of things. I was certain about the righteousness of war, certain about duty and honor and fighting for what's right. But certainty can be its own kind of blindness. He told them about his conversation with Karen, about seeing her grief mixed with fear, about recognizing in her attachment to the land something that mirrored his own deep need for belonging. The lawyers say we can win, he continued, that the legal precedent is strong that we can reclaim not just this property, but potentially others taken during the same period. They're talking about setting precedent, about sending a message. And you don't want to send that message? asked Sarah Blackhorse, one of the younger council members. I want justice, Joseph said slowly. But I'm starting to think justice might be more complicated than I originally believed. Meanwhile, across town, Karen sat in her own kitchen struggling with revelations that had shaken her understanding of her family's history. The documents spread across her table weren't property records this time. They were genealogy research she'd started after meeting Joseph, trying to understand her own family's connection to this land. What she'd discovered made her sick. Her great-grandfather, Harold Mitchell, had been among the government officials involved in the 1924 relocation of local tribes. Not a key figure, but a clerk who'd processed paperwork, who'd helped facilitate the transfers that had moved Joseph's family and dozens of others away from their ancestral lands. The irony was devastating. Her family's eventual ownership of this property wasn't just legally complicated, it was morally compromised at its very foundation. Emma's voice on the phone that evening was sharp with disbelief. Mom, you can't be serious. You're talking about some distant relative from a century ago. That has nothing to do with us. Doesn't it? Karen asked. If our family benefited from an injustice, even indirectly, doesn't that create some kind of obligation? To give up our house, to abandon everything Dad worked for? Emma's voice rose. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. This is grief talking, not reason. But Karen wasn't sure anymore what constituted clear thinking. David had always said that ethical decisions were rarely comfortable ones, that doing the right thing often required sacrifice. She'd agreed in principle, but she'd never imagined being asked to sacrifice something this fundamental. That same evening, Joseph received a call he'd been dreading. His younger sister Maria, who lived 2 states away, had heard about the legal claim from other family members. Are you completely insane? She demanded without preamble. You're going to bankrupt yourself fighting for some symbolic victory that won't bring Mary back or change what happened. It's not about bringing anyone back, Joseph replied. It's about recognition, about saying that what happened to our family mattered. What happened to our family was that they survived, Maria shot back. They adapted, they built new lives, they raised children who became teachers and nurses and soldiers. Mary's legacy isn't some piece of property, it's us. It's the fact that we're still here. The conversation continued for an hour, rehashing old family arguments about assimilation versus resistance, about the best ways to honor their ancestors' memories. But Maria's words stayed with Joseph long after they hung up. What was Mary's real legacy? Was it the land she'd lost, or the strength she'd passed down to help her descendants survive that loss? 2 days later, Karen made a decision that surprised, even her. She called Margaret Tallbear directly. I want to meet with the tribal council, she said. Not through lawyers, not as part of negotiations. I want to speak to them directly. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm not sure that's advisable. Anything you say could potentially be used in legal proceedings. I don't care about legal proceedings anymore, Karen replied. I care about doing what's right. The meeting was arranged for the following week. As Karen prepared for what felt like the most important conversation of her life, she found herself returning repeatedly to David's workshop in the basement, surrounded by his tools and his unfinished projects, seeking guidance from a man who'd always seemed to know the difference between legal and moral obligations. But this time, David's voice in her memory offered no easy answers. This time, she would have to find her own way through the maze of competing claims, historical injustices, and present-day realities. This time, the right choice, assuming there was one, would have to emerge from her own conscience, her own understanding of what it meant to live with integrity in a world where the past and present were inextricably tangled. The tribal council chambers had never felt more sacred or more daunting to Karen, as she stood before the assembled community members. Joseph sat to her left, his presence both comforting and complicated. Margaret Tallbear had tried one final time to dissuade her from speaking without legal counsel, but Karen had been resolute. I'm not here as a defendant or an adversary, she began, her voice steadier than she'd expected. I'm here as someone who's discovered that her family's history is more connected to yours than I ever imagined. She told them about Harold Mitchell, about the documents she'd found, about the sick realization that her family had been part of the system that had displaced theirs. The room was completely silent as she spoke, and Karen could feel the weight of generations of pain and resilience in that silence. "I can't undo what my great-grandfather participated in," she continued. "I can't bring back what was taken from your families, but I can try to make things right in the only way available to me now." Rosehawk Woman's eyes were sharp with attention. "What are you proposing, daughter?" The word daughter hit Karen, unexpectedly carrying an intimacy she hadn't anticipated. "I don't know yet, but I know that fighting this in court, making it about legal technicalities and property rights, isn't going to honor anyone's memory or heal anyone's wounds." Joseph shifted beside her, and she could sense his surprise. This wasn't the conversation any of them had expected. "The land remembers," Karen said, echoing Joseph's earlier words. "It remembers Mary Crowfeather's garden and my daughter's first steps. It remembers ceremonies and celebrations, grief and joy. All of it matters. All of it is part of what makes that place sacred." Daniel, Joseph's cousin, leaned forward. "But sacred to whom? You can't share sacred ground like you share a business contract." "Can't you?" Karen asked. "Or maybe the question is whether we're brave enough to try something that's never been done before." Over the following weeks, what emerged was indeed something unprecedented. Working with Margaret Tallbear and a team of creative legal minds, they began crafting an arrangement that honored both families' connections to the land without requiring either to surrender their claims entirely. The house would remain Karen's for her lifetime, acknowledging her family's 23 years of residence and the reality that displacement caused harm, regardless of its historical justification. But the property would be held in a special trust that recognized the tribal community's cultural and spiritual connections to the land. Joseph would have permanent access for cultural practices and family remembrance. The garden area would be redesigned to incorporate both Karen's herb cultivation and traditional indigenous plantings, with Mary Crowfeather's 3 sisters growing alongside modern vegetables. The prayer tree would be formally recognized as a cultural site, with appropriate ceremonies and protections. Most importantly, the arrangement would include an educational component. The property would become a teaching site, where the full history of the land, both its indigenous heritage and its subsequent development, would be preserved and shared with future generations. But the legal framework was easier to construct than the emotional reality of sharing space that both families considered home. The first few months were awkward, sometimes tense. Joseph's initial visits felt like intrusions to Karen, reminders that her ownership was conditional, complicated. For Joseph, seeing Karen's daily routines in spaces where his great-grandmother had once lived was its own form of displacement. A breakthrough came during the first planting season under their new arrangement. Karen had been struggling with the design of the shared garden, trying to balance her practical needs with the cultural requirements Joseph had described. Frustrated and overwhelmed, she'd finally called him. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't want to mess up something that's sacred to your family, but I also don't want to lose the connection to gardening that's helped me deal with David's death." Joseph had been quiet for a long moment before responding. "Mary would have understood your grief. She lost people too, maybe. Maybe you could teach me about your herbs and I could share what I remember about traditional plantings." The first joint gardening session was tentative, formal, but as they worked side by side, preparing soil that had nourished families for generations, something began to shift. Karen shared stories about David's love for her cooking, how certain herbs brought back memories of meals they'd shared. Joseph talked about Mary's legendary ability to heal both bodies and spirits with plants she'd cultivated. "She never got to pass down all her knowledge," he said, carefully transplanting sage seedlings. "The relocation happened too quickly. Some things were lost." "Then maybe we can discover new things together," Karen suggested. "Not to replace what was lost, but to honor it by continuing to learn." Emma's first visit home after the arrangement was finalized was difficult. Karen's daughter struggled to accept sharing her childhood space with strangers, even strangers with legitimate claims. But gradually, as she heard the full story and witnessed the careful respect with which Joseph approached the property, her resistance began to soften. The moment that changed everything came during a summer evening when Emma found Joseph sitting beneath the prayer tree, clearly struggling with some internal battle. "Are you okay?" she asked, surprising both of them with her concern. Joseph looked up at this young woman who was nearly the same age he'd been when he'd first deployed overseas. "I keep thinking about what my great-grandmother would say about all this. Whether she'd approve of sharing this place instead of reclaiming it entirely." Emma sat down beside him, something that would have been unthinkable months earlier. "What do you think she'd say?" Joseph was quiet for a long time. "I think she'd say that the land was never meant to belong to just one family. That the earth is big enough for multiple kinds of love, multiple ways of calling a place home." As autumn arrived, the shared garden produced its first harvest. The ceremony to celebrate it included both Karen's simple gratitude rituals and traditional Indigenous ceremonies of Thanksgiving. 3 generations of both families gathered around tables laden with food grown in soil that had sustained families for over a century. Rose Hawk Woman, now 87 and moving more slowly but still sharp as ever, pulled Karen aside during the celebration. "You did something brave, daughter," she said. "Not just legally brave, but heart brave. That's rarer than you might think." Karen felt tears starting. "I just tried to do what David would have wanted, what felt right." "Mary would have liked you," Rose continued. "She always said the earth was wise enough to hold multiple truths at once. Maybe people can learn to be that wise too." As winter approached, both Karen and Joseph found themselves changed by their shared custody of memory and place. The arrangement they'd created was imperfect, sometimes challenging, requiring constant communication and compromise. But it was also something unprecedented, a recognition that historical injustices could be addressed without creating new ones, that healing was possible even when complete restoration wasn't. Standing together in the snow-covered garden, planning for the spring plantings that would blend their family's traditions even more deeply, neither could have imagined this outcome a year earlier. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the most important changes were always the ones that nobody could have imagined until they became necessary. Spring arrived early, and with it came a revelation that would test everything Karen and Joseph had built together. The call came from Margaret Tallbear on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other, with Karen having her coffee beneath the prayer tree and Joseph arriving for his weekly check on the traditional plantings. "We've received another claim," Margaret said without preamble. "A development company has been researching historical property records in the area. They're challenging the legitimacy of our arrangement, claiming it creates an unlawful precedent for tribal land recovery." Karen felt the familiar sick twist in her stomach. "What does that mean?" "It means they're trying to force a legal resolution that would either grant you complete ownership or grant us complete ownership. No middle ground. They have significant financial backing and political connections." The irony was bitter. Sunrise Development Corp., the company challenging their arrangement, was owned by Harold Mitchell's great-nephew, a distant cousin Karen had never met, who saw opportunity in the legal complexity surrounding Indigenous land claims. He was betting that forced litigation would either result in the tribe winning the land outright, which he could then purchase, or in Karen winning clear title, which would eliminate the tribal claims and make the property available for development. "They can't do this," Emma said fiercely when Karen explained the situation. Emma had driven home immediately, her semester abroad in Spain cut short by crisis. "We have a legal agreement. We have a working solution." But Joseph, sitting in Karen's kitchen for what felt like a war council, looked grim. "Legal agreements can be challenged, and they have resources we don't have." The next few months were a maze of depositions, court filings, and media attention that none of them had anticipated. The case became a symbol for different groups with different agendas. Property rights advocates used it to argue against Indigenous land claims. Indigenous rights groups worried that their creative solution would be seen as a dangerous precedent that weakened legitimate treaty claims. Development interests saw it as an opportunity to acquire valuable land. Through it all, Karen and Joseph found themselves defending their arrangement to people who couldn't understand why they would want to complicate simple ownership. Lawyers on both sides tried to convince them to abandon their shared custody agreement and fight for complete control. "You could win," Karen's new attorney insisted. "The tribal claim is based on 100-year-old grievances. You have clear title. Going back decades. Don't let sentiment override your legal rights." But Karen had moved beyond thinking about rights. She was thinking about responsibilities. To Emma's future, to Joseph's healing, to the land itself, to the example they were trying to set about reconciliation being possible. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Karen testified about her family's life on the land, about her discovery of Harold Mitchell's role in the 1924 displacement, about her belief that some wrongs required more than legal solutions. Joseph spoke about military service and PTSD, about how connection to ancestral land had saved his life, about his great-grandmother's stories and their power to sustain hope across generations. But the most powerful testimony came from Rose Hawk Woman, now 88 and requiring assistance to reach the witness stand. Her voice was soft but carried clearly through the courtroom as she spoke about the difference between ownership and belonging, between legal possession and spiritual connection. "That land has seen many kinds of love," she said, looking directly at the judge. "The love of people who fed their families from its soil, the love of people who raised children in its shelter, the love of people who buried their grief in its gardens. Does wisdom require us to choose between these loves, or does it ask us to honor them all?" The judge, a man nearing retirement who had presided over decades of property disputes, took an unusually long time to render his decision. When court reconvened, his expression was thoughtful rather than decisive. "This case has required me to consider not just legal precedent, but the purpose of law itself," he began. "Law exists to serve justice, not to complicate it. The arrangement these parties have created may be unconventional, but it serves the interests of justice better than any decision I could impose." He ruled that their shared custody agreement was legally valid and could not be overturned by third parties without evidence of harm or fraud. More importantly, his written decision established a framework for similar arrangements in other cases involving historical land disputes. The victory was sweet, but it came with a price. The legal battle had been expensive and emotionally exhausting. More significantly, it had attracted attention that none of them wanted. Reporters continued to call asking about their experiment in reconciliation. Academic researchers wanted to study their arrangement. Other families with similar disputes reached out for advice. "Sometimes I wonder if we've made things more complicated than they needed to be," Karen confided to Joseph one evening as they worked together in the garden. The spring planting had become a cherished ritual, a time when they planned not just the year's crops but their continued collaboration. "Maybe," Joseph agreed, carefully transplanting tomato seedlings near the traditional corn plot. "But maybe, complicated is more honest than simple. Maybe the real world requires more nuanced solutions than we're usually willing to attempt." Emma, who had returned to finish her degree but now visited home more frequently, overheard their conversation. "You know what I think?" she said, kneeling to help with the planting. "I think you've created something that will outlast all of us. Not just the legal arrangement, but the proof that people can choose understanding over winning." As summer deepened, their shared space continued to evolve. Karen had learned to identify traditional medicinal plants and began incorporating them into her herb garden. Joseph had started helping Emma with a college project documenting the oral histories connected to the land. The prayer tree had become a gathering place for extended family from both sides, a spot where different traditions could coexist without competition. The harvest celebration that year was larger than before, including not just family, but friends, neighbors, and some of the other families who had reached out for guidance with their own land disputes. As Karen looked around at the assembled group, Indigenous elders sharing stories with suburban neighbors, children from different communities playing together beneath the ancient oak, tables laden with food grown in soil that had nourished families for generations, she felt something she hadn't experienced since David's death. a sense of rightness, of being exactly where she belonged. Rose Hawk Woman, now requiring a wheelchair but still commanding respect through her presence, called for quiet as the sun began to set. "In the old days," she said, "we understood that some gifts can only be received by